Our main character was the ultimate academic slave. He studied day and night to finally graduate from his master's program. But his reward? A swift kiss from the legendary Truck-kun. When he opened his eyes again, he had turned into a crying infant. What in the world was going on? Thanks to years of binge-reading webtoons, he immediately realized the truth. He had reincarnated. His new identity in this world was Li Han, the third son of the illustrious 𝒂𝒊𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕 bloodline. They were the absolute apex of the Empire's magic families. At first, he celebrated his golden spoon status. A noble life meant he could live luxuriously without lifting a finger. But reality hit him like a second truck. In this ruthless world, the eldest son inherited absolutely everything. He was left with nothing but dust. Driven by pure survival instinct, he vowed to become a supreme mage. Mages were highly respected elites everywhere they went. Basically, it was a guaranteed meal ticket. Time flew by, and the grown-up Li Han finally entered the prestigious 𝒁𝒊𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕. It was the Empire's most elite institution, but also a sanctuary of pure madness. Why? Because the principal running this madhouse was a terrifying, floating blue skull. Rumors claimed he was an absolute lunatic who sacrificed his own flesh to achieve dark immortality. Even the homeroom teacher was a ferocious ogre. She casually promised the class that she wouldn't eat her students. But if her hunger peaked, no guarantees. Today was the chaotic entrance ceremony. He quickly formed an alliance with Yona from the renowned Mikan family. It was a respected magical bloodline. Joining them was the 97th prince, Ganando. Despite his royal blood, his actual status was basically rock bottom compared to those two prodigies. In their first practical lesson, the magic teacher demonstrated a basic light attribute spell. Almost every student cast it with ease on their first try. It seemed like child's play. But as they repeated the spell, extreme exhaustion struck. One by one, their mana pools ran completely dry. By the 7th cast, only Li Han stood tall, still shining brightly. The teacher was utterly paralyzed by shock, usually pushing past the 5th cast to find a true genius. She desperately rushed over to examine his mana core. In that split second, her senses were swallowed by a boundless, roaring ocean. It was an unfathomable depth of magical energy. This was his true, terrifying power. Before this class, the Skull Principal had explicitly warned Professor Garcia to keep a close eye on Li Han. That undead monster could see right through every new student. He had declared that Li Han was a monstrous prodigy who carried the weight of massive expectations. The real reason Professor Garcia summoned him was because the magical energy sealed within him was too volatile. It flowed endlessly like the vast Pacific Ocean. But before he could celebrate his overpowered status, the professor hit him with a brutal reality check. Having such an explosive amount of raw mana meant absolute hell for his control. Garcia handed him a mysterious magical artifact designed to continuously absorb his overflowing energy. But Li Han still needed to actively drain his own reserves. Therefore, he was granted special permission for independent training. This privilege left him torn about his elective classes. Should he skip practical magic entirely? When he heard Yona chose alchemy, that foolish Prince Ganando immediately mocked her. His reward? A devastating punch from the furious girl that sent him flying. On their way to the alchemy sector, they crossed paths with students from the Black Tortoise Tower. Some flinched in absolute terror, while others glared with burning hostility. Li Han quickly realized something crucial. Approaching potential allies with too much warmth might actually trigger a hostile backlash. Unlike the psychotic Skull Principal and the flesh-eating ogre teacher, the alchemy professor was surprisingly normal. He was a stout dwarf named 𝒂𝒊𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕. While the pampered nobles complained about not having their lesson inside a luxurious, climate-controlled classroom, Li Han easily deduced the brutal truth. Outdoor classes meant one thing: savage survival and material hunting. The absolute most vital requirement for mastering alchemy wasn't possessing supreme intellect or overflowing talent. It was raw, gritty gathering skills. When an arrogant girl named Arenas dared to talk back, Professor 𝒂𝒊𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕's fury erupted like a volcano. He unleashed a terrifying aura, roaring his truth. Magical herbs weren't cheap weeds you could just grow in a backyard. Even with infinite gold, finding authentic ingredients was a bloodbath. That savage explanation was enough to silence them. He tossed each student a sketch of a weird, root-like mushroom. Their mission? Hunt down this toxic spiritual herb used for deadly poisons. Staring into the pitch-black, spine-chilling forest, Li Han and Yona knew they needed a sturdy party. But Princess 𝒂𝒆's faction had already formed an ironclad alliance. Even though she was merely the 44th princess, her radiant beauty and overwhelming talent made her the absolute center of attention. While weighing their scarce options, Li Han's sharp gaze locked onto a solitary elf. She was Nila from the Black Tortoise Tower. Not only was she a fierce dark elf, but also a member of the Night Patrol, the legendary northern recon hunters. Li Han and Yona immediately approached her, proposing a tactical alliance. Having suffered the arrogant scorn of nobles before, Nila coldly rejected them. But Li Han unleashed his masterful persuasion. Braving the Death Forest alone was pure suicide. Surely, no one was foolish enough to throw their life away. Irritated but trapped by his flawless logic, she reluctantly agreed. Living up to her elite hunter status, Nila moved like a phantom. She dashed through the canopy, leaping flawlessly from branch to branch. From the very beginning, Li Han had analyzed her perfectly. Taking in her explosive leg muscles and the deep battle calluses on her palms, he was absolutely certain she was a hardened veteran of the wild. More importantly, that glaring Night Patrol badge on her waist was a dead giveaway. Only a blind fool would miss it. Roles were swiftly established. Nila would vanguard the path, Yona would analyze the spiritual herbs, and Li Han would act as the absolute shield. But the moment Nila heard his 𝒂𝒊𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕 family name, her face went deathly pale. The entire world feared the rumors of his bloodline. They said the family head was a monstrous human dragon. With a single breath, he could instantly incinerate a legion of the undead. The cursed 𝒂𝒊𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕 lineage had forged dark pacts with ancient souls, trading their very humanity for godlike power. Devoid of all emotion, they once annihilated an entire village during a mission without a single shred of mercy. That was why the world trembled at their name. Yet, looking at the easygoing Li Han, Nila figured the rumors were heavily exaggerated. Suddenly, while swinging through the dense foliage, Nila dropped to the ground like a shadow. She had spotted the menacing tracks of a wild beast. What truly shocked her was seeing a pampered noble like Li Han show genuine, predatory interest. 𝒁𝒊𝒃 Academy was built on rich, mana-overflowing lands. Naturally, this overwhelming energy attracted terrifying monsters. Some were savage beasts, while others were grotesque mutations born from failed experiments, or from recklessly discarded potion waste, mutating into deadly slimes. The trio instantly shifted their battle formation. They began tracking the beast's movements to prevent a lethal ambush. After advancing through the oppressive shadows, Yona finally secured 2 of the toxic herbs, but Li Han and Nila were tense as drawn bowstrings. A colossal wild boar, radiating violent magical energy, had locked its deadly gaze on them. With killer intent filling the air, Li Han drew his magic wand. In an instant, it expanded into a massive, heavy battle staff. Long before stepping foot into this academy, Li Han was forged in combat. By age 10, he had been trained to master every weapon known to man. His ultimate trump card? The ability to infuse explosive mana directly into cold steel. It was the legendary threshold of aura. Thanks to the brutal training under Master Jack, he was a lethal weapon. A chilling light flashed in Li Han's eyes. Boom! He thrust his heavy staff straight through the demonic boar's throat. It collapsed dead in a single strike, leaving his 2 teammates frozen in absolute disbelief. His reinforced staff was practically indestructible, wielded like a devastating spear. During that lethal thrust, Li Han had subconsciously unleashed his dense mana. Though it wasn't quite a full aura blade yet, it proved he could survive any nightmare. But before they could even catch their breath or yank the staff free, a blood-curdling monster's roar ripped through the forest. Rushing to investigate the chaotic noise, they found Princess 𝒂𝒂𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕 by party cornered by danger. Suddenly, a long-haired student with glasses stepped forward to face the threat. It was none other than Asan, the pride of the Dankar family. While the legendary 𝒂𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒕's family had advised emperors for generations, serving as the ultimate right hand and imperial treasurers, this guy? He thought he could calculate the monstrous boar's attack pattern. He dodged, struck a critical blow, but against a beast the size of a mountain? His attack was nothing more than a mosquito bite. The demonic boar retaliated, kicking him 7 meters through the air like a rag doll. Seeing the absolute destruction, 𝒂𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒕 finally stepped onto the battlefield. Just as the monster prepared to charge, a devastating strike pierced the beast. The forest echoed with its dying shriek as it dropped dead on the spot. Li Han had hurled his magic staff like a divine spear, saving the so-called princess from this budget-tier dragon. Without missing a beat, Li Han turned to her. With your noble connections, do you know any classes where I can breathe and still get an A? But before she could answer, a suffocating dark aura descended upon them. A shiver ran down Li Han's spine. This terrifying pressure. It perfectly mirrored the soul-crushing dread of his past life at university. The source of this darkness? Professor 𝒂𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕𝒆𝒅. The eccentric professor was hunting for fresh talent. Li Han deployed his ultimate defense, the flawless, corporate customer service smile, trying to decline. But the professor's obsession was unbreakable. Seeing the absolute terror in his students' eyes, the professor finally called off the lesson. The truth was revealed. He had intentionally lured those demonic beasts. It was a brutal survival test to forge their herb-gathering skills under extreme life-or-death pressure. But the moment 𝑦𝒐𝒏𝒊𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕𝒆𝒅 herb they had scavenged, Professor 𝒂𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒂𝒕 lunged forward like a starved predator. The three students froze in pure fear, as the professor practically forced Li Han into his grueling alchemy class. Li Han mentally planned his own funeral. He had to accept his dark fate. However, because he had miraculously slain the demonic boar and secured the divine herb, he was granted exclusive VIP access to a hidden sanctuary deep in the Forbidden Woods. Considering the academy cafeteria served absolute garbage, this magical cabin was a paradise. It was fully stocked with fresh, vibrant ingredients, resembling a high-end royal buffet. Blinded by the glorious promise of actual food, Li Han threw away his hesitation and joined the alchemy faction. The trio dragged the massive boar's corpse straight to the cabin, ready to claim their spoils of war. Thanks to his vast knowledge, Li Han knew exactly how to butcher a monster. 𝒂𝒈𝒆 looked like she was about to faint, but the hunger overpowered her noble pride, and she rolled up her sleeves. Nobody could resist the legendary temptation of fresh meat. Nila, a seasoned hunter, was completely in her element. While 𝒂𝒈𝒆 struggled with the raw ingredients, they wielded the enchanted blades provided by the professor. The great dismemberment began. They expertly carved the beast, hanging prime cuts of meat like trophies. The intestines were transformed into premium survival sausages, while Li Han took charge of smoking the remaining supply. The craziest part? In just 3 days, he had completely mastered the art of alchemy. Professor 𝒂𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕𝒆𝒅 was practically weeping tears of joy at his genius. With Li Han commanding the kitchen like a supreme chef, a legendary feast materialized before them. They devoured the food like wild beasts freed from captivity. But a massive problem remained. They had a mountain of smoked meat left over. Innocent Nila smiled gently. We should share this blessing with our classmates. The moment those words left her mouth, Li Han and 𝒂𝒈𝒆 snapped their heads toward her. Are you crazy? We sell it to those pampered nobles for an absolute fortune. Their minds synced perfectly as they high-fived. Nila was stunned. She had no idea her friends were absolute demons for gold. These three geniuses burned with the fierce passion of youth, but their chaotic energy was a walking disaster. They were absolutely destined to turn this prestigious magic academy upside down. Meanwhile, back at the Blue Dragon Tower, a place that normally reeked of dirt and despair, a heavenly, mouth-watering aroma suddenly invaded the halls. The starving students tracked the divine scent like zombies, only to discover Li Han and 𝒂𝒈𝒆 running a massive barbecue. Eat until you burst. Only 1 silver coin per plate. To the desperate students, this was a divine bargain. Deprived of decent food for days, the kids wept tears of absolute joy, chanting Li Han's name like a literal god. Little did these poor fools know, the demonic duo was charging triple the market value. Deep within the dorms, Prince Gainando burst out of his coffin-like bed, awakened by the noise. The moment his eyes locked onto the meat, he lunged forward like a starved goblin, but Li Han blocked his path with a terrifying glare. Pay up, Your Highness. No cash? No problem. Li Han magically summoned an IOU contract he had prepared ages ago. The tragic prince fell straight into the capitalist trap, yet he signed it while sobbing tears of profound gratitude. Time skipped forward. The students grumbled in confusion. Why were they forced to take basic magic properties? They had already mastered this basic garbage. Before their complaints could escalate, a bone-chilling voice echoed through the room. The Skull Principal had arrived. He was personally overseeing this mandatory class. One glance at their glowing, healthy faces, and the principal instantly deduced they had been secretly feasting. A silver-haired noble dared to complain about gathering his own food, only to be instantly silenced by an invisible, choking magic. Absolute dominance. Historically, the Black Tortoise Tower dominated the academy. Filled with arrogant aristocrats, they never lifted a single finger. Meanwhile, the Blue Dragon Tower always ranked dead last, sitting at the absolute bottom of the food chain. But this year was different. Their undisputed leader was Li Han. The principal was genuinely shocked. How did such a chaotic, free-spirited anomaly emerge from the mercilessly strict 𝑹𝒂𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕𝒆𝒅 bloodline? The true reason for this basic ethics class was purely political. If these little monsters graduated and terrorized the empire, the emperor himself would write a royal complaint to the principal. Past generations of students had caused catastrophic disasters, resulting in the principal getting chewed out by the royal court. So, he used this meaningless class as his absolute shield, proving to the world he was a teacher of high moral virtue. Their very first lesson? Mindlessly repeating the chant, "I will not cause absolute destruction with my magic." Did this psychological brainwashing actually work? Nobody knew. After wasting time on useless philosophy, the class finally ended. But the principal grinned. He needed 2 sacrifices for a special chore. The students instinctively avoided eye contact, but Li Han's mind raced. There had to be a hidden reward. So, he boldly raised his hand. Seeing this, the cowardly prince turned pale with terror. But driven by his twisted sense of loyalty, he prepared to sacrifice himself to join his friend. However, Asan completely intercepted the opportunity. He desperately wanted to repay his life debt to Li Han. Right in the middle of this dramatic brotherhood moment, the principal brutally shattered the mood. The task? They had to manually hand-copy the entire academy rulebook for the entire class. The sun was already setting, and their progress was practically zero. Li Han's past-life survival instincts awakened. He immediately began scanning the room for a cheat code to end this nightmare. This was the principal's personal lecture hall. There was a 100% chance a magical shortcut was hidden nearby. Asan caught onto the brilliant plan, and the two split up to raid the room. Li Han's sharp eyes locked onto a suspiciously enchanted drawer. The moment he yanked it open, boom! A terrifying spectral illusion of the skull principal popped out, giving them a massive jump scare. After mercilessly mocking the naive students, the phantom spit out the incantation for basic manipulation magic, and instantly vanished into thin air. Asan was trembling with rage, ready to march to the office and file a formal complaint. But Li Han stopped him. Complaining would only result in the principal laughing in their faces. The success rate of arguing was absolutely 0%. Their only option was to master the spell. Asan glared at his pen until his mana completely hit rock bottom, but the useless object refused to move a single millimeter. This spell required the mental balance of walking a tightrope. Closing his eyes, Li Han tapped into his darkest memories. The soul-crushing trauma of university deadlines. Focusing all his past life desperation into a single point, he commanded the pen on the floor to rise. A magical miracle. The pen actually twitched, floating into the air completely under Li Han's absolute command. But before he could even exhale a sigh of relief, the pen went completely rogue. It shot out the window like a sniper bullet. It annihilated a hanging apple and buried itself deep into an ancient tree. The brutal truth of this spell? You had to maintain a continuous, rapid-fire chant, while keeping an unbreakable mental fortress. Refusing to give up, Li Han immediately activated the spell for a second time. But out of nowhere, the principal's actual face popped up at the window. The sudden distraction shattered Li Han's focus. The magic went totally berserk. The enchanted pen shot violently in every direction, before diving straight for the principal's forehead. In a flash of light, the principal deployed a defensive barrier, incinerating the rogue pen into absolute dust. Shaking off the chaos, Li Han completely changed his attitude. He instantly played the innocent student, begging to know the secret of controlling this demonic spell. The principal put on an arrogant front, claiming every first year mastered it easily. But it was all a massive bluff. Deep down, he knew it required blood, sweat, and insane magical grinding. A little practice was all it took. But when the eccentric principal got bored, he instantly teleported our main character straight to the cafeteria. Meanwhile, another poor soul was mercilessly tossed into the infirmary just to recover their drained mana. The dining hall was dead silent, feeling more like an abandoned ghost town. With nothing but dry bread and plain rice balls in sight, Li Han smirked. Thanks to his secret stash of smoked meat, this meal turned into an absolute feast. Even the heavens would not dare interrupt his lunch. However, Princess Ada suddenly tracked him down. She handed over the requested course list, detailing the academy's most popular classes: general alchemy, linguistics, ballroom dancing, and social studies. But as a practical genius, Li Han wanted the exact opposite. He needed those dead courses with zero competition to effortlessly snatch the highest grades. Thankfully, the princess also compiled a warning list of classes to avoid. First up, basic swordsmanship. Second was ranged magical combat. This academy was packed to the brim with arrogant nobles. Why would anyone want to punch and kick each other for a grade? The very next day, Li Han was forced to walk to class completely alone. Not a single person dared to accept his invitation. To his absolute shock, the ranged magical combat class was banished to an isolated, incredibly gloomy basement. The academy legends always warned the students, never even dream of entering the Mage Tower. That is, unless you wanted a one-way ticket to the afterlife. It was not about getting trapped inside. You would simply perish within its cursed walls, and the infamous Rogar Tower was the prime example of this deadly reputation. Yet, possessing the heart of a lion, our overpowered main character boldly decided to explore it. Suddenly, the eccentric principal materialized right behind his back. Li Han instantly seized the golden opportunity. He unleashed his ultimate flattering skills to beg for a secret manual. But the stingy old man refused to cough up any treasures. Instead, he mockingly handed Li Han a white memorial chrysanthemum. Left with no other choice, the young mage confidently marched forward. He descended into the first level of the dreadful basement. Right before his eyes was the arena for basic ranged magical combat. Pushing the heavy doors open, he found exactly 3 miserable souls sitting inside. Placed squarely in front of each student was a spherical orb resembling a crystal ball. Without warning, an eerie voice echoed from the shadows. Pale skin and razor-sharp fangs. There was a 100% certainty this sinister being was undeniably a pure-blood vampire. This was none other than 𝑹𝒆💊💏💄𝒂𝒓, the terrifying master of this course. Those glowing blue stones were star spheres, forged from the extremely rare astral meteorite. They were born from the celestial process where the very stars radiated their divine energy across the cosmos. Merely placing a hand on it and injecting a tiny fraction of mana sent the sphere shooting effortlessly into the air. The reason it looked so incredibly easy was because these items were ancient artifacts, bearing the professor's personal magical sigil. A purple-haired girl completely lacked the mana to control it. The spiritual sphere rocketed into mid-air, forcefully boomeranging right back into her fragile stomach. A devastating blow. Yet, the cold-blooded 𝑹𝒆💊💏 only checked if his precious artifact was damaged. Their absolute mission was to levitate the orb and trace a perfect circle. In the blink of an eye, one arrogant student completed the task. He immediately began showing off his genius, but the professor refused to even glance his way, coldly commanding him to repeat the process until the circle was absolutely flawless. Witnessing this nightmare, the 2 remaining guys desperately made up excuses. They begged for a bathroom break just to escape the cursed classroom. The purple-haired girl also tried to run for her life, but collapsed instantly onto the cold floor. Li Han rushed over to check on her, quickly realizing the poor girl was entirely drained of her magical core. After carrying the pitiful student to a resting area, our dedicated main character returned to endlessly tracing magical circles. Since this brutal class graded purely on student rankings, it was basically a free feast handed on a silver platter for Li Han. If drawing a few pathetic circles guaranteed top marks, only a fool would refuse this golden opportunity. Every single year, swarms of hopeful students would enroll, only to play the ultimate disappearing act. They all ran away. Even without a single student, the stoic professor visited the lecture hall daily before silently returning to his dark abyss. But Li Han was different. He flawlessly executed every command without a single shred of complaint. From his refined tone to his elegant movements, it was crystal clear he hailed from a highly prestigious, well-educated bloodline. Although he could not yet fathom the true depths of Li Han's magical potential, 𝑹𝒆💊💏 secretly hoped this resilient boy would endure long enough to learn the next forbidden chapter. Meanwhile, Li Han was happily bragging about finding a legendary class where he got rewarded for doing practically nothing, but hearing that he merely traced circles all day. His friends Jonah and Gando were left completely and utterly baffled. Too lazy to explain his genius master plan, he decided to devour this sweet cake of easy grades all by himself. Dusting off his robes, Li Han confidently marched toward the basic swordsmanship class. The vast courtyard directly facing the magnificent southern main building served as the holy ground for sword training. The training field was swarming with a sea of energetic students. What was worse, it was absolutely dominated by the elite disciples of the White Tiger Tower. Those meatheads were all heirs to prestigious knight families, boasting terrifying mastery over the blade. Spotting a lone Blue Dragon Tower mage like Li Han, vicious whispers began echoing through the crowd. Stepping out from the shadows of doubt, an arrogant green goblin swaggered up to assert his absolute dominance. But our overpowered main character did not flinch for a second. He casually roasted the fool, promising not to hurt him too badly during their eventual duel. The provocation made the goblin's face boil, bright red with blazing fury. Suddenly, a thunderous voice shattered their standoff. A menacing warrior bearing a jagged scar across his face and a cold iron prosthetic leg stepped into the light. This was the legendary Professor 𝒂𝒊𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕, a battle-hardened elf. Who would drill the art of the sword into these brats this semester? Since every single noble in this arena already possessed foundational swordplay, he would ruthlessly forge their combat instincts instead of wasting time on baby steps. Out of nowhere, a heavy hand clapped onto Li Han's shoulder. The boy questioned why a pureblood from the legendary 𝑭rdahn's magic family would ever dirty his hands with a sword. Li Han shamelessly spat out the brutal truth. It was just to farm easy points. The brutally honest answer left the boy utterly speechless. This blonde-haired youth was 𝒍𝒊𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕. The Marathi bloodline guarded the unforgiving frozen wastelands of the north, living by merciless, ironclad laws. To achieve their absolute goals, they would not hesitate to use any ruthless, underhanded tactics. On the other hand, the Azure Stone Sword was a divine technique our hero mastered under the great Al Long. Li Han had literally shed blood, sweat, and scales to comprehend its profound mysteries. When Professor 𝒂𝒊𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕 witnessed such an incredibly stable foundation belonging to a 𝑭rdahn's magic prodigy, shock rippled through his veteran soul. But the moment he heard the boy was only studying the blade for academic credits, devastating disappointment crashed over the professor's face. Terrified of losing his precious grade points, Li Han frantically spun a web of lies. He desperately claimed his soul was inexplicably captivated by the majestic path of the sword. Instantly, the professor's eyes gleamed with maximum approval. However, our genius mage had unknowingly triggered the old warrior's battle frenzy. Drawing his blade, the professor demanded a spar with Li Han right then and there. In less than a heartbeat, our hero was mercilessly beaten into a bloody pulp, completely battered and bruised. Meanwhile, the professor stood like an immovable mountain, without a single hair out of place. The moment Li Han crawled away to catch his breath, another unfortunate victim was dragged in and beaten senseless. Professor 𝒂𝒊𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕 possessed a godlike ability to perceive the absolute smallest weakness. Because of this, our main character tasted endless, bitter defeat. This mentor was an absolute beast in human skin. The arrogant white tiger disciples destined to become future knights were all brutally crushed within a single terrifying breath. Despite his prosthetic limbs, the veteran warrior moved like a phantom dancing in the wind. Even while delivering beatdowns, he continuously dropped legendary pearls of wisdom, fueled by his unfathomable mastery over swordplay. But anyone with eyes could see the truth. Li Han was catching the heaviest beatings of them all. Without warning, he was summoned back into the arena alongside that extremely arrogant green goblin from earlier, 𝒍𝒊𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕. The strict professor granted the two rivals permission to settle their bubbling blood feud. That pathetic monster instantly flashed a sickening, victorious smirk. But he had mocked the absolute wrong person. Our genius mage had sacrificed his entire cursed childhood, enduring hellish training just for a moment like this to shine. The real reason Professor 𝒂𝒊𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕 selected these two was because they stood at the absolute pinnacle of their peers. The path of the sword was never just about empty theories. It required the baptism of actual, life-and-death combat. Raw battlefield experience was the ultimate deciding factor. Therefore, both warriors were not only exceptionally skilled, but they also possessed the rare talent of infusing destructive magic into their weapons. Truthfully, Professor 𝒂𝒊𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕 held a secret bias toward Li Han. In his mind, he had conjured a tragic backstory where this sword-loving prodigy was cruelly oppressed by his magic-obsessed family. The grand duel erupted, the legendary Crescent Peak sword art, unleashed by the green freak, focused purely on blinding speed and relentless rhythm. However, Li Han's Azure Stone Sword condensed earth-shattering power into every single strike. This was truly a breathtaking clash between two totally opposing martial philosophies. 𝒍𝒊𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕, the green menace, violently charged forward, swinging his blade wildly. But our overpowered main character gracefully sidestepped the fatal blow. Smooth as silk, he casually kicked a blinding cloud of sand straight into his opponent's face. The surrounding noble students gasped, thinking it was a disgustingly dirty trick. Yet, the veteran professor smirked with deep satisfaction, praising it as a true survival tactic for real-world battlefields. Wasting exactly 0 seconds, Li Han viciously swung his enchanted blade forward to secure his absolute victory. But luckily for that fool, the true battle had begun. Li Han effortlessly deflected the relentless barrage of incoming strikes. Not giving his opponent a single inch to breathe, he pinned the guy down with a crushing kick to prevent any cowardly escape. Juru hit the dirt hard. Swallowing his pride, he executed a desperate roll to dodge the onslaught. He quickly gathered his shattered resolve and charged forward again, but his desperate strikes met an unbreakable wall. Both students had completely shattered Professor Enan's wildest expectations. However, while Juru was gasping for dear life, our overpowered main character stood as calm as a tranquil lake. He perfectly read every single movement. Every pathetic attack was predicted with terrifying ease. It was finally time to end this little game. The moment Li Han unleashed a sliver of his true aura, pure terror flashed in Juru's trembling eyes. That suffocating killing intent was the perfect opening. Blinded by absolute panic, Juru's previously sharp swordsmanship fell apart into a sloppy mess. Fatal openings appeared everywhere across his defensive stance. To make matters worse, the mana blade surrounding his weapon was rapidly flickering out. The fool was completely running on fumes. Victory was just moments away, and Juru finally realized the horrific truth of his situation. He was throwing pebbles at a towering mountain, while the poor guy was paralyzed by overwhelming dread. Li Han moved like a phantom. With a devastating strike, he sent Juru's sword flying into the sky. In a flash of cold steel, the blade rested dangerously against his throat. The victor was decided. A calmer opponent might have stood a chance, but this arrogant junior was completely out of his league. Our genius mage stood there looking absolutely legendary and untouchable. The surrounding students watched in pure awe and deep fear. Naturally, a proper duel always ends with a noble handshake of mutual respect. Surprisingly, Juru lowered his head and offered his hand. He actually swallowed his immense pride and apologized for his previous disrespect. Sensing genuine honor in the boy, Li Han smoothly reached out to accept. He firmly returned the handshake to seal the match. However, the shadows of the academy always hide venomous snakes. That night, an arrogant rat named Gel viciously mocked Juru's defeat, screaming that the White Tiger faction's honor was stained. Boiling with toxic rage, Gel commanded an immediate 3-on-1 midnight ambush against Li Han. A few noble students cringed at this cowardly tactic, but absolute fear of authority kept their mouths tightly shut. Disgusted by such a pathetic and dishonorable scheme, Juru walked away. Of course, another spineless lackey eagerly stepped up to take his place. No matter how incredibly powerful Li Han was, a 3-on-1 blindside was practically a death sentence. Choosing honor, Juru sprinted through the dark campus using all his strength to warn our hero. But just as he opened his mouth to shout, a massive boulder violently whizzed right past his face. Spotting an unconscious upperclassman groveling on the dirt, Juru frantically dove into the bushes. There he witnessed a display of absolute magical mastery. Li Han was effortlessly utilizing telekinesis to mercilessly snipe his ambushers from the shadows. Just moments ago, these three fools thought they had him cornered. But with a single chilling glare and a whisper of their family names, the cowards nearly wet themselves in terror. Yet, they foolishly decided to attack anyway. Realizing some hidden mastermind was pulling their strings, Li Han calmly watched the academy trash charge straight at him. The ancient martial scrolls state that fleeing is the ultimate strategy, but our overpowered main character had absolutely zero escape routes. Tapping into his vast mana pool, he commanded the very earth beneath his feet to rise. A magically enhanced rock instantly slammed into a thug's skull, knocking him out cold in a single devastating strike. Sure, Li Han's elemental control was still slightly unpolished and grazed the wrong target, but a true genius adapts on the battlefield. Maintaining an incredibly terrifying poker face, he mentally crushed their remaining fighting spirit. The surviving cowards turned and ran for their miserable lives. Spotting Juru hiding in the shadows, Li Han instantly raised his wand for a lethal strike. But the boy frantically explained his innocent intentions. Through this midnight encounter, the ugly truth was finally revealed. Gel was the cowardly mastermind pulling the strings all along. The White Tiger faction was way more toxic than anyone realized. Looking at a hastily drawn sketch, Li Han recognized the annoying rat who approached him earlier. The villain's motive was painfully obvious. Defeating a monstrous genius from the legendary House of 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 would instantly skyrocket that loser's reputation. Furthermore, Li Han's overwhelming talent with the blade had bred a massive amount of toxic jealousy among the elite students. With a master manipulator painting a target on his back, the sword class was about to turn into a war zone. Returning to his tower, he pondered Juru's sincere warning to avoid the White Tiger House. But surrender free academic points? Not in this lifetime. Activating his brilliant mind, he instantly faked a tragic and bloody injury. Stumbling into the common room, he put on an Oscar-worthy performance. He cried that those savage white tigers brutally jumped him without mercy. Hearing their precious comrade was attacked, the Blue Dragon House erupted into blazing fury. Remembering the delicious meat feast he had generously provided, the fiercely loyal students immediately grabbed shovels and iron bars for war. Just as the bloodthirsty mob marched out, Asan blocked the grand staircase. He wisely reminded them that the White Tigers descended from heavily trained knight families. A direct clash would result in a catastrophic bloodbath and broken skulls. Instead, the calculating Asan darkly suggested, they launched their own cowardly ambush from the shadows. But our brilliant main character stepped up to stop the madness. He reminded them of their supreme noble pride, stating they should never act like filthy street thugs. By simply waiting for the enemy to strike first, they could violently destroy them in glorious self-defense. His flawless logic completely cooled their raging blood, leaving them ready to spring the ultimate trap. The following day brought a highly anticipated joint lecture between the rival classes. It was finally time to witness the breathtaking miracles of light magic. But beneath the calm academic surface, a deadly silent war of deception was currently brewing. That morning, Li Han looked like a walking corpse after pulling a brutal all-nighter. Meanwhile, the sneaky Ganando cast aside all his dignity. He secretly pulled out a juicy sausage and roasted it over the crackling fireplace. The mouth-watering scent tortured the violently starving students. They were practically ready to chew on their own leather boots for survival. Academy rations were ridiculously brutal. A desperate heist to steal from Professor Uron's pantry had already ended in total disaster. Stepping into the basic magic classroom the next day, Professor Garcia instantly sensed the predatory tension and agonizing hunger dividing the towers. The insane skeletal headmaster firmly believed that ruthless starvation and fierce competition would forge the ultimate generation of elite mages. However, the compassionate professor completely despised that demonic philosophy. With a commanding flash of her beautiful yet terrifying eyes, she locked onto the unruly students, ordering the chaotic brats to sit down and shut their mouths. When she asked who had successfully mastered the light spell, our overpowered protagonist casually raised his single hand. The rest of the noisy trash hadn't achieved a single thing. But suddenly, the breathtakingly fierce Princess Aiden also raised hers. She immediately shot a piercing death glare straight at Li Han. The naive Asan assumed her hostility stemmed from toxic academy rumors. Whispers claimed Li Han was a great obsessed monster who greedily hoarded his magical secrets. Boiling with defensive rage, Asan cursed the princess for believing such trash. Seeing Li Han gracefully ignore the deadly glare, Asan worshipped him as the ultimate pinnacle of noble forgiveness and holy virtue. Mastering divine light magic in a mere 7 days was a legendary feat. Yet these two monstrous geniuses made it look like absolute child's play. Observing the fiercely burning rivalry among her students, Professor Garcia sighed at the endless academic bloodbath. She dramatically announced their plunge into elemental wizardry, mastering the primal forces of water, fire, earth, wind, and shadows. Was the absolute holy grail of magical foundations. Without it, summoning ancient elemental spirits or wielding divine, world-shattering artifacts was completely impossible. Drawing her intricately carved wand, she prepared a breathtaking demonstration of elemental resonance. With a single, resonant tap against the grand desk, a simple training candle materialized out of thin air. She softly whispered the ancient incantation to ignite. Instantly, that pathetic little wick erupted into a world-shattering, majestic pillar of divine flames. It was an incredibly awesome display of absolute magical supremacy. Li Han closed his eyes to visualize the spell. He was just about to chant the incantation when Professor Garcia abruptly stopped him. She suddenly remembered the past. His overwhelming light magic had nearly blinded everyone. If this monstrous genius used fire magic right now, he might actually blow the entire tower to pieces. So, he was restricted to practicing only water magic. But water just lacked that absolute destructive coolness. Fire and lightning were the ultimate offensive choices. Earth and metal were the supreme defensive arts. Water, however, had completely vague combat applications. But for the sake of his own survival, he had no choice but to accept it. Noticing that extra named Asan glaring at him with burning jealousy, the main character simply suppressed his aura and decided not to crush him. Facing the simple water basin, Li Han merely tested the waters with 3 brief chants. Boom! He instantly succeeded in commanding a perfect sphere of water. Professor Garcia was absolutely ecstatic to discover such an unrivaled genius in her class. Typically, those born into blacksmith bloodlines possessed a natural affinity for the fire element. Cadets raised in fishing families naturally harmonized with the water element, and children of the endless plains resonated deeply with the wind. The more one interacted with an element, the greater their magical compatibility became. But our main character had absolutely zero connection to the water attribute in his current life. His only profound connection to water was a traumatic memory from his past life, when a university professor had mercilessly dunked his head into a swimming pool. Distracted by that memory and a jealous girl named Arenas, his concentration wavered. Splash! The water sphere collapsed, soaking him to the bone. Professor Garcia immediately cast a high-tier drying spell on him. Because our overpowered protagonist possessed a monstrous, never-ending ocean of mana, he was ordered to sustain the water sphere until the lecture ended. It was at this exact moment that Li Han realized a horrifying truth he had somehow forgotten. There was not a single sane instructor in this entire academy. They were all completely unhinged maniacs who loved torturing their students. Maintaining a spell for a prolonged duration placed crushing pressure on the caster's mind. It was as impossibly difficult as balancing a spinning top on a single fingertip. But our genius protagonist needed this brutal training. Despite possessing magical reserves as vast as the Pacific Ocean, he was still a raw, unpolished diamond waiting to awaken his true potential. However, Li Han simply assumed the crazy professor just wanted to make him suffer. He desperately fled to seek out Professor Uran instead. The Imperial Princess could effortlessly dominate the fire element. Jonah resonated perfectly with the wind. Gando had almost incinerated the entire classroom. Yet Li Han was the only one forced to stand there holding a pitiful ball of water. And now, he was reduced to doing hardcore agricultural labor for this old man. Just a short while ago, Li Han had strategically offered his manual labor in exchange for precious food. He planned to smuggle some bags of rations back to his starving dorm mates. Professor Uragon felt something was incredibly suspicious. Why was a noble from the terrifyingly strict Wardana's bloodline constantly stealing food like a common thief? Usually, the Blue Dragon and White Tiger factions were locked in an eternal, bloody rivalry. It was a legendary feud present in every single generation. But Li Han did not care about dorm politics. He only cared about hoarding as many survival points as humanly possible. However, he had already beaten the living daylights out of those White Tiger elites. When the professor heard that Li Han had casually enrolled in the swordsmanship class, he spat his hot tea everywhere in pure shock. The White Tiger dorm was the sacred territory of the Knight lineages. Our protagonist had basically declared war on their home turf. Hearing the crazy kid casually brag about fighting 1 versus 3 made the old man's jaw drop even further. He immediately sprinted to the kitchen to cook the boy a massive feast, utterly terrified that Li Han would one day become the realm's strongest swordmaster, and return to exact bloody vengeance for this brutal student labor exploitation. This rundown shack was managed solely by Professor Uragon. No ordinary student could ever survive. His hellish, slave-like cleaning schedule. Spotting a patch of empty dirt, Li Han shamelessly asked to plant some cabbages. The wise professor instantly saw through the boy's greedy soul. He was totally planning to sell them on the black market. The old man was left completely speechless. With these premium cabbages, they could cook an absolute masterpiece of a seafood stew. The great empire was divided into distinct cultural zones. The Western Wardana's family survived on basic bread and cheese, but the Easterners possessed a divine culinary culture of rice and noodles. The professor absolutely worshipped Eastern cuisine, but he had a bitter blood feud with the people from that region. The reason? His annoying relatives never stopped nagging him about being dead broke and completely single. Meanwhile, the academy students had devolved into a state of primal starvation. Before they burned the entire magical academy to ashes, they needed a hardcore survival strategy. The Black Tortoise faction gathered ingredients. The White Tiger meatheads hunted beasts. The Blue Dragons relied on their wits. Only the Vermilion Bird weirdos sat in deep meditation, acting like their bodies were entirely immune to the agonizing hunger. Li Han immediately locked in a weekend hunting schedule. If any arrogant extra dared to cross his path, he would crush them without mercy. But those cowards would probably hide in their shells like frightened turtles anyway. The academy grounds were heavily fortified by an impenetrable magical steel wall. Yet, against all odds, every single year, legendary seniors managed to break out into the outside world. A successful prison break meant glorious new clothes and heavenly food. But our main character was not a brainless musclehead like those white tiger fools. He would never execute such a reckless, suicidal plan. While his eyes gleamed with absolute cunning, the scene shifted. Inside a pitch-black room, Juru was totally surrounded by 3 masked figures. The mastermind behind this shadow operation was none other than Li Han. That is right. These 3 completely failed to emit any terrifying villainous aura. Sighing at their incompetence, Li Han ripped open the curtains to let the sunlight in. Because Juru had dared to show kindness to our protagonist, the rest of the White Tiger faction had viciously outcast him. They needed this dramatic, theatrical performance to move the poor boy's heart. But it took less than 3 seconds for Li Han to reveal his true, calculating nature. He demanded Juru to become his ultimate undercover spy. His mission? To report every single move the arrogant Gel made. Because the title spy sounded way too pathetic, they upgraded his codename to the legendary Pied Piper. It definitely had a much cooler ring to it. Poor Juru walked right into the genius mage's psychological trap and officially became his loyal subordinate. The real reason Li Han had summoned his secret society at the crack of dawn was to scheme the ultimate grand escape from this hellish academy. But before he even had to use his silver tongue, he realized Juru had been plotting the exact same thing. Even martial arts, prodigies, and high-ranking nobles were completely powerless against the devastating agony of an empty stomach. Earlier, inside the White Tiger Tower, those reckless fools had almost sparked a riot demanding a hunting expedition, but the cold-blooded Gel had ruthlessly shut them down. The mythical beast Li Han had previously slaughtered was actually released by a professor on purpose. If they really wanted to hunt true monsters, they would have to step into the deadly, cursed forest. Realizing the immense danger, Gel hatched a brilliant scheme to break out of the academy. He declared himself the vanguard who would secure glorious feasts for his starving faction. No one knew if this insane prison break was actually possible, but the desperate students were manipulated flawlessly. They blindly agreed to join that arrogant bastard's grand escape. And naturally, Gel crowned himself the absolute commander of the operation. Anyone who dared to make a single mistake would face his merciless wrath. Hiding perfectly in the shadows, Juru had eavesdropped on this entire secret meeting. Hearing this absolute goldmine of intelligence, Li Han's eyes instantly blazed like twin suns. He completely forgot about their previous bloody duels and began plotting how to shamelessly hitch a free ride on their escape plan. But surviving in this magical academy was never that simple. Our genius protagonist had originally planned to patiently map out an infallible escape route. However, the unhinged faculty made every single step a deadly gamble. Who would have thought that the arrogant Gel actually possessed a viable master plan? Gel was incredibly sharp, cold, and a master of manipulating the masses. So his bold claim was practically a guaranteed success. Left with no other options, Li Han ruthlessly pushed his new subordinate into the line of fire. Juru had to shadow Gel and extract the critical intel. The poor boy felt this tactic was deeply dishonorable, but with his flawless silver tongue, Li Han unleashed a psychological masterclass. He convinced the naive boy that knowing the enemy was the absolute peak of martial arts strategy. This was not a cowardly spy mission, it was the ultimate art of war. Overwhelmed by our protagonist's flawlessly handsome face and unshakable confidence, Juru was completely brainwashed into accepting the mission. With the absolute command issued, Li Han mercilessly kicked the boy out into the danger zone. He then flashed a devastatingly handsome, utterly confident smirk. Our overpowered genius mage had flawlessly manipulated the fragile psychology of the naive Juru. Now, it was time for the real game to begin. The absolute audacity to manipulate others. Yona and Gondo seriously thought our main character had mastered brainwashing magic before even stepping foot in the academy. That afternoon, Nalia was dragged into the scheme, though at first, she was completely against it. She wanted to refuse, but knowing the mastermind was Li Han, success was practically guaranteed. So, she reluctantly agreed. But the moment she heard the plan was to tail Gael, the poor girl was left utterly speechless. However, Yona pointed out that the operation would crumble without Nelia's specific skill set. In the blink of an eye, Li Han switched into pure acting mode, heavily emphasizing the absolute importance of Nelia. He praised her tracking abilities and deadly hunter instincts, lifting her ego straight to the heavens. Completely falling for his sweet talk, she enthusiastically threw herself into the mission. Under the light of a full moon, Gael led his entire faction on a grand escape operation. He clutched a secret map of the academy grounds, something he had found a month before the entrance exams, deep inside the Marathi estate. While searching for useful magical artifacts, he had stumbled upon this escape route left by a senior student. At the time, he thought he would never have to resort to such cowardly tactics. But right now, it was his greatest treasure. However, every single move the White Tiger faction made was being watched by Li Han's crew, perfectly hidden in the shadows. The targets were taking the mountain path for a stealthy getaway. Juru was assigned the heavy burden of carrying Gondo. Nelia, being a master hunter, moved through the terrain with flawless grace. Meanwhile, the boys had excellent stamina. Yona was also used to foraging for herbs on treacherous peaks, so the climb was no issue. The only dead weight was the spoiled rich kid, who collapsed after taking exactly 3 steps, forcing Juru to piggyback him the whole way. Suddenly, the White Tiger group halted in their tracks. It wasn't because they found the exit. Without warning, the surrounding atmosphere turned, bone-chillingly cold. A terrifying presence was approaching. It couldn't be monsters, as Nelia had already scouted the area flawlessly. That left only one nightmarish possibility. A surge of familiar blue magical energy completely engulfed the White Tiger students. The insane principal's floating skull materialized in the air. This was a trap all along. That precious map Gale had been guarding with his life was a complete fake drawn by the old man himself. The parchment crumbled into dust right in his hands. Never trust an item with a shady origin. And to rub salt in the wound, the maniacal principal burst into evil laughter right in Gael's face, humiliating them all. Watching from afar, Li Han's group was absolutely speechless. It was crystal clear that this twisted old man just wanted to play with their fragile little hearts. The principal then summoned a massive undead army of skeleton warriors to herd the terrified students back to the academy. Desperation kicked in. By any means necessary, if they could just escape these undead horrors, they might avoid punishment. Faces pale as ghosts, the White Tigers grabbed their robes and ran for their lives, witnessing this terrifying legion of death. Even Nelia nearly lost her mind from fear, ready to sprint in the opposite direction. Thankfully, Li Han grabbed her arm and calmly reassured her. Even if they were caught, the penalty would just be basic physical training, nothing more. But Nelia's dramatic imagination was already picturing a medieval torture chamber. Meanwhile, facing the monstrous skeleton army, the arrogant White Tigers actually drew their weapons, wanting to fight. A battle to the death. Fools truly know no fear. Seeing this, Juru suggested they team up with the White Tigers so everyone could escape together. But our pragmatic main character coldly agreed with a twist. They would sneak away while the idiots bought them time as meat shields. Juru was left utterly dumbfounded. Was the entire Azure Dragon faction this shameless? Ignoring him, Li Han analyzed the battlefield for a weak point. But the undead were literally everywhere. The terrifying truth dawned on him. That crazy old principal was endlessly spawning more skeleton monsters. One second he says he will let them run, and the next, he cuts off their only escape route. Did he think these freshmen had god-tier stamina to wipe out an undead legion? However, the most crucial detail was, the undead soldiers completely ignored Li Han's group. Even the principal didn't glance their way. This could just be a targeted illusion spell, similar to the ones used in the lecture halls. If so, they only needed to run in the exact opposite direction of the White Tigers to secure their safety. Acting like a seasoned captain, Li Han expertly navigated his crew out of the danger zone. 30 minutes later, they discovered a hidden cave. It was perfectly secure, without a single trace of monster aura. They decided to set up camp and rest. The overly kind-hearted Juru was still worrying about the rival faction, deeply regretting that he hadn't helped them break the siege. But in this brutal academy, survival of the fittest is the only law. How could anyone defeat an undead army swarming like ants? After marching for so long, their canteens were completely dry. Without breaking a sweat, Li Han casually cast water magic to quench everyone's thirst. Seeing Yona shivering from the bitter mountain wind, Nelia ignited her fire magic for warmth. Both girls secretly envied each other's elemental affinities. The two of them stepped outside to scout the perimeter. The horde of skeletons was still crawling everywhere. While they were busy cursing out the demonic principal, several shadows staggered out from the thick brush. It was Gale and the battered remnants of the White Tiger faction. Showing surprising mercy, Li Han invited the rivals into their sanctuary to rest. Given their past arrogance, he could have easily left them to die in the dirt. Yet, our brilliant mage graciously offered them water like a true saint. However, Gael was highly suspicious about why the Azure Dragon students were here. He arrogantly assumed Li Han had also found a secret map, completely unaware that he had been tracked the entire night. Memories flashed back to his childhood training, where he was taught the strict Marathi family creed. Never forget a grudge, and always repay kindness with betrayal. A sinister smirk crept onto Gael's face as he approached Li Han to gain his trust. But suddenly, one of his underlings collapsed like a sack of potatoes. Then another fell, and another. By the time Gael realized the terrifying truth behind Li Han's angelic smile, it was entirely too late. The potent toxin hit Gael's bloodstream, and he crashed face first into the dirt. Our overpowered main character had finally neutralized the annoying rivals who hated him for no reason. With a devilish grin, Li Han justified his ruthless tactics. The water wasn't spiked with lethal poison, just a heavy sedative that would knock them out for a while. Yona and Nelia were in on the plot the whole time. Li Han then casually ordered his team to drag their unconscious bodies straight to the skeleton army. He knew damn well that if he didn't strike first, these snakes would have backstabbed him. The drug came from a sleeping herb Yona had spotted earlier. Crushed and mixed with water, it created a flawless, homemade sleeping potion. While the White Tiger fools were lost in sweet dreams, the undead dragged them by their ankles back to the academy. And with their targets captured, that grotesque skeleton army would finally despawn after completing its mission. Now, Li Han was completely free to explore the outer walls. There was absolutely no way he was returning empty-handed. But after marching relentlessly through the dark, exhaustion hit the group hard. Gando was wobbling like jelly, completely out of gas. Even Juru, who had the stamina of a magical beast, was panting heavily. Since they had traveled this far without being caught, they assumed they were finally safe. Wanting better visibility, Li Han casually ignited a ball of magical light, but the very second his magic flared to life, a booming, ancient voice echoed through the dark. It furiously demanded they turn off the light and let people sleep. The entire group froze in absolute terror, thinking they had just awakened a high-level ghost. But shockingly, the voice belonged to a massive, ancient talking tree looming right behind them. The mystical tree immediately issued a deadly challenge. Answer its riddle correctly, and they become honored guests. Answer wrong, and they die as intruders. Here is the riddle. A dwarf lit 5 candles, but a fierce wind blew out 2. Furious, the dwarf stormed off and locked every single door. The question is, how many candles were still left? This was clearly a psychological trap. The remaining 3 candles would have completely melted away by the time the dwarf returned. But before anyone could stop him, Gando impulsively yelled out his answer. 3. And miraculously, he was absolutely right. In this magical world, dwarves always cast preservation spells on their candles so they never burn down. Thus, 3 remained intact. Against all odds, they had just become the VIP guests of the ancient tree. The trial was not over yet. To win the ultimate prize, they had to face a second riddle. What is a giant in the morning, shrinks at noon, and grows massive again in the afternoon, only to vanish entirely by nightfall? While the others stood completely baffled, Li Han confidently smirked. The answer was a shadow, and his flawless logic hit the mark. Strangely enough, the ancient legend of the Sphinx remained unchanged across different worlds. To think that this mythical trial existed even in this magical dimension. Suddenly, a massive surge of mana completely enveloped their bodies. In the blink of an eye, the scenery warped. They were teleported into a mysterious, lush green forest, standing before a towering, ancient spirit tree. The mystical being offered them a glowing green liquid that looked exactly like lethal poison, but one single sip sent a heavenly jolt through their veins, as refreshing as ice-cold water after a brutal marathon. When Li Han revealed his name and his bloodline as 𝑴𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒕, the ancient tree visibly flinched. Talk about a notorious family reputation. However, the ancient being, surprisingly, took a liking to the handsome genius, gently patting his head. It then asked why they were wandering around so late at night. Without even blinking, Li Han smoothly lied that they were just taking a midnight stroll. But you cannot fool an ancient spirit. The tree knew they were actually trying to escape the magical academy. Dropping the act, Li Han directly asked for an exit route. The tree warned that while a path existed, students could never use it. The academy walls were heavily enchanted. Touching them would fry a person to absolute crisp. It advised them to drop their escape plans, especially since terrifying monsters would begin waking up in just a few weeks. Yet, this deadly warning did not spark an ounce of fear in Li Han. Instead, it ignited a blazing determination in his eyes, keeping its earlier promise. The ancient tree decided to reward the overpowered protagonist. Thick branches violently erupted from the earth, revealing a breathtaking artifact. It was an ancient magical staff pulsing with unimaginable power. For any true mage, a staff is as vital as their own heart. While pathetic first-year students were only given cheap, wooden wands, Li Han was already claiming a legendary, high-tier weapon as his very own. Grasping the majestic artifact, Li Han felt zero resistance. Instead, a flawless wave of mana synchronized completely with his soul. The ancient entity was absolutely dumbfounded. It could not believe that the proud, ancient spirits dwelling within the staff had submitted to a mere boy so easily. However, the tree refused to teach Li Han how to wield it just yet. True mastery required time and intense training. Staring at this monstrously talented genius, the tree was instantly reminded of the legendary madman from the 𝒂𝒊𝒏𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕 family. They shared the exact same terrifying aura. Realizing it was time for them to return, the ancient tree mercilessly threw the entire group out of the forest, shouting a final, desperate warning. Li Han must never use that staff near any buildings. With his bottomless mana, he would literally nuke the entire campus. The group was violently thrown back into reality, crashing face first into the dirt. The mystery Li Han had been pondering was finally solved. After being kicked out of the spirit realm, the horrifying skeleton army had vanished without a single trace. The whole insane ordeal felt like a fever dream. Dragging their exhausted bodies down the mountain, they collapsed into their beds like dead logs. But just as they closed their eyes, someone started frantically smashing their door. It was An, panting heavily, bringing chaotic news. The crazy skull headmaster was hosting a massive, unexpected event outside. Li Han instantly remembered how his group had secretly stalked the White Tiger faction the night before. Yet, he kept his poker face flawless. A grand, spectacular festival was booming across the campus. Surprisingly, this was not an execution block for the runaway students. Instead, it was a majestic, welcoming banquet for high-ranking priests from all over the empire. Spotting an elegant, holy sister, thanking him for the lavish party, the shameless lich headmaster immediately demanded she praise him to the emperor to secure more funding. Sweating nervously, the nun quickly changed the subject. Meanwhile, Li Han narrowed his eyes. He could clearly sense that these were no ordinary members of the clergy. Their bodies were radiating a massive, overwhelming aura, completely different from regular mana. His sharp instincts were dead on. They wielded a unique, absolute energy known as divine power. But in a moment of sheer carelessness, Li Han accidentally exposed his god-tier mana detection skills to the crazy headmaster. The glowing skull merely laughed, telling the boy to embrace his monstrous talent. Honestly, this was the very first time Li Han had encountered real priests. The headmaster felt the same way. As an immortal lich, he scoffed at the very concept of blind faith. After all, the elite 𝒂𝒊𝒏𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕 family taught that divine magic was nothing more than an illusion fueled by human belief. Normally, religious fanatics stepping foot on their territory would be violently thrown out. But Li Han was built differently. Seeing mountains of free food and resources, his survival instincts kicked in. He shamelessly asked the headmaster for recommendations on which religion to join. Yes, this mad lad was planning to join a multi-faith organization. The headmaster instantly read his wicked mind. The boy just wanted to infiltrate these holy groups, brainwash them, and farm them for infinite food tributes. This utterly diabolical plan delighted the headmaster beyond words. Completely entertained, the old lich gladly laid out his top 3 choices. First was the prizing faith, a group of absolute martyrs willing to sacrifice everything, meaning free entry for anyone. Second was Kano, the god of chaos. His followers simply did not give a single care about other deities. Finally, there was Kapu, the absolute god of swordsmanship. Dropping these juicy hints, the headmaster teleported back to the torture room to deal with yesterday's escapees. He vanished into thin air, leaving Li Han completely dumbfounded. Just then, Yona walked up to greet him, but our greedy protagonist was already scheming to exploit all 3 faiths without sparing a single one. Reaching into her basket, Yona casually pulled out a delicious sandwich. She had scored free premium food from the Flaming Faith, who worshipped the god of alchemy. Because her wealthy family was their main sponsor, she got the absolute best cuts of meat. Hearing this, Li Han felt his soul shatter. Why could his overpowered family not sponsor a god for free food? Putting on his best corporate fake smile, he marched straight toward the followers of the Prising Faith, leaving the entire academy staring in absolute confusion. Looking closely, he noticed a super rare half-demon hiding in their ranks. In this world, if an ancestor made a demonic pact, their bloodline would bear the curse for generations. Outcast for her dark, demonic features, the girl stood there trembling timidly. It was Daling, a student from the legendary Phoenix Tower. Turns out, Li Han was not the only student looking to join a cult today. But there were two golden rules when joining a divine faith. What can you exploit? And what price must you pay? The second, Li Han stepped inside the holy tent, his eyes locked onto a treasure trove of high-tier magical artifacts on display. Before his greedy mind could formulate a heist, Madame Madrid made her grand entrance. With every step she took, the very earth cratered beneath her boots. This terrifying gravity was caused by the cursed artifact she was wearing. Whoever equipped it would have their physical weight multiplied to crushing levels, and she was not wearing it for hardcore strength training. It was all for prizing, because their god carried the crushing weight of the world. The devoted followers literally crippled themselves with artifacts to share his divine burden. A massive headache slammed into Li Han. That devious lich headmaster had played him. These fanatics were completely obsessed with insane self-sacrifice. He instantly turned around to run for his life. But before he could escape, Madame Madrid pulled out an artifact designed to aggressively absorb mana. For an overpowered monster like Li Han, whose mana pool was overflowing, this cursed artifact is exactly what I need. Li Han's attitude completely flipped in a heartbeat. He was suddenly overflowing with enthusiasm. You see, curses act like reflections in opposing mirrors. The stronger the rebound, the deadlier the hex. And the deadlier the hex, the more overwhelming the power it conceals. This divine relic of the god prizing was no ordinary trinket. Not only did it carry a crushing gravity curse, but it also amplified divine energy to terrifying levels. The item resting inside the box was a legendary invisibility artifact. However, it possessed a fatal flaw. It violently drained the user's mana. Sister Madrid fully expected him to reject such a dangerous burden. But she underestimated our protagonist. Li Han put on his best Academy Award-winning performance. Claiming he would sacrifice himself for the greater good, he solemnly accepted the cursed relic. Sister Madrid was practically brought to tears, revering him as a living saint descended from the heavens. Little did she know, his inner self was throwing a massive victory party. Free overpowered loot delivered right to his doorstep? Yes, please. Resting inside the chest was a high-tier mana belt, practically buzzing with top-grade invisibility magic. The moment Li Han grasped the item, two mysterious figures suddenly appeared. Historically, any devoted believer who dared to wear this relic suffered devastating side effects from its overwhelming pressure. And yet, Li Han casually strapped the cursed belt around his waist. He did it as effortlessly as putting on a pair of pants. Not a single drop of sweat, not even a flinch. The religious devotees watching were absolutely shell-shocked. Their jaws practically hit the floor. They genuinely believed they were witnessing the birth of a supreme disciple. Wasting no time, Li Han channeled his mana into the belt. A shadowy, cloak-like aura instantly enveloped his body. And then, in a single heartbeat, he vanished without a trace. This was no cheap optical illusion. It was absolute stealth. Even his reflection in the mirror was completely erased. The difference between premium gear and standard trash was crystal clear. After test driving his new toy, Li Han deactivated the magic. To him, the so-called deadly curse felt like a mere mosquito bite. Putting his shameless mask back on, he humbly offered to bear even more burdens for the god prizing. Sadly, his greedy attempt to scam more artifacts completely failed. Still, walking away with a legendary invisibility belt was a massive win. Sneaking out of this hellish academy would now be a total breeze. As the agonizingly boring lecture finally ended, a lecture our protagonist completely tuned out, by the way. Sister Madrid presented him with a massive basket overflowing with premium food. Jackpot! This was his true objective from the very beginning. But suddenly, Daylin silently pushed her own share of food toward him. She sternly declared that a true servant of the god prizing had no right to indulge in such sinful luxuries. Without waiting for an answer, she turned on her heel and promptly walked away. Her noble vermilion bird tower pride completely overpowered her basic hunger. Meanwhile, Li Han glanced at the other students, who were literally grazing on grass like a herd of starving cattle. So much for aristocratic dignity. Just as Li Han grabbed his loot and prepared to bail, the sister grabbed his sleeve. She begged him to look after Dylan, worried about the girl's extreme self-punishment. Our genius mage was immediately going to reject this annoying side quest, until Sister Madrid pulled out another massive basket of food as an advance payment. Naturally, Li Han's attitude did a complete 180. Helping a fellow academy classmate? Why, it was his absolute moral duty. After securing the bag, he proudly marched back to his dorm, heavily armed with delicious tributes. Life for the students in the Vermilion Bird Tower was brutally dull. Morning, noon, and night, their routine was nothing but endless praying. Some fanatics took it even further, sneaking deep into the monster-infested mountains at midnight just to prove their devotion. Even though the Einrogard Academy strictly enforced a brutal night curfew, the Vermilion Bird students possessed a massive loophole. Since they were officially classified as monks, they were basically given a free pass to roam around. The gears in Li Han's genius brain immediately started spinning. If he simply disguised himself as a devout monk, he could completely bypass the crazy principal's illusion patrols. Action followed thought. He immediately cornered Dalen to borrow a set of religious robes. Staring at Li Han's suspiciously eager grin, she could only sigh and hand them over. Phase 1 of his grand escape master plan was an absolute success. But our protagonist never forgot his main objective, the mandatory side quest to monitor Dalen's health. When he casually mentioned how worried Sister Madrid was, the strict girl's tough facade finally cracked. To ensure she actually consumed some calories, they sat down for a shared meal. Outwardly, he played the role of a caring supervisor. Inwardly, his brilliant, calculating mind was playing four-dimensional chess. With just one shared meal, he had successfully indebted her to him. A perfect pawn for his future survival plans. Meanwhile, deep inside the faculty meeting room, the academy professors were violently summoned by the unhinged principal. The agenda? The highly anticipated basic equestrian training course was about to begin. The original plan was for Professor Vendozone to lead the class. Unfortunately, the man had utterly failed his mission to capture a wild unicorn. Out of sheer humiliation, the professor was currently throwing a tantrum and hiding in the wilderness. But the crazy, skull-faced principal always had a backup plan. It was only in desperate, chaotic moments like this that the faculty actually recognized the principal's terrifying competence. To fill the sudden vacancy, he brought in an absolute legend, a master of the Thunder Tribe, Madame Ras. She wasn't just some dusty academic. She was a world-renowned explorer who had conquered the Empire's most savage frontiers single-handedly. While the rest of the staff sighed in relief, Professor Uragom looked like he was about to have a heart attack. He aggressively protested the decision. The massive bear man was literally writhing in absolute agony. Why? Because this legendary explorer was actually his nagging aunt, a woman who never stopped rambling about the Eastern dwarves. The principal, however, simply brushed off his despair with chilling indifference. He claimed this ruthless hiring was purely for the students' educational benefit. Yeah, right. At that exact moment, just outside the academy gates, the fierce woman arrived. Looming behind her was the terrifying silhouette of a titanic, monstrous bird. Finally, the day of the basic equestrian training course finally dawned. The first-year students were practically vibrating with excitement. Since horseback riding was a traditional noble art, they assumed it would be an easy, relaxing grade. But just as Li Han let his guard down, believing his academy life was finally getting peaceful, an ear-piercing screech shattered the sky. The students looked up in pure horror as a colossal avian beast dive-bombed them at breakneck speed. Its target? The unlucky noble kid, Ganando. The poor boy sprinted for his absolute life. But it was useless. The monstrous beast mercilessly snatched him off the ground. Just like that, the imperial prince was kidnapped into the heavens. As the entire class erupted into pure, unadulterated panic, our overpowered main character, Li Han, remained as cool as a block of magical ice. "Get your heads down! Break its line of sight!" he roared, instantly taking command. But the sky demon wasn't finished. It aggressively banked around for a second strafing run. Out of nowhere, a student started, screaming their lungs out, cursing the insane principal for this death trap of a school. A silver-haired noble furiously yelled at the idiot to shut his mouth. Swoop! In a cruel twist of fate, The silver-haired boy was violently snatched into the sky too. Wait a minute. If the other guy was the one making all the noise, why did the beast target him? The pieces of the puzzle instantly clicked in Li Han's genius brain. Ganondo's golden hair, the other kid's silver hair. It's targeting shiny objects. Cover your damn heads, he bellowed. Right as he cracked the beast's attack pattern, an icy voice echoed from behind him. You figured it out instantly. Li Han, our protagonist, spun around, locking eyes with a fierce, unexpected presence. The rest of the class immediately panicked. It was a student from the brutal White Tiger Tower. Assuming she was here to start a bloody turf war, the Blue Dragon nobles prepared to unleash their magic. But to everyone's shock, Princess 𝒂𝒂𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕 fearlessly stepped forward, throwing her absolute authority behind the mysterious girl. The truth dropped like a bombshell. This was no ordinary student. She was Rina, an elite imperial knight directly serving the princess. However, Einrogard Academy enforced thousands of tyrannical rules. Since personal bodyguards were strictly forbidden, the fiercely loyal knight had successfully infiltrated the hellish school as a regular student. Unfortunately, their differing combat styles forced them into opposing faction towers. Anyway, enough backstory. Right now, the real tragedy was poor Ganondo. The pathetic prince was currently dangling in the sky like a helpless piece of human bait, completely ignored by everyone. Although the monstrous bird's chaotic flight path seemed to be stabilizing, there was no guarantee this feathered nightmare wouldn't suddenly dive-bomb the remaining students. And that meant someone had to take absolute command of this battlefield. Our brilliantly lazy main character was a second away from instantly declining the job. Why volunteer for a deadly boss raid? But before he could slip into the shadows, the entire squad of aristocratic mages unanimously forcefully elected him as their supreme commander. Surrounded by a wall of absolute fanaticism and blind trust, Li Han could only release a soul-crushing sigh. He had no choice but to start barking out tactical orders. You see, just a few days prior, Knight Rina received a shocking intelligence report. The supreme leader pulling the strings of the Blue Dragon Tower wasn't Her Highness the Princess. It was the youngest son of the prestigious family, Li Han. The proud knight was absolutely furious. After all, Princess 𝒂𝒂𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒓 was born with the natural charisma of a ruling sovereign. How could she let some noble upstart steal her liege's rightful throne? She vowed to destroy his political power. But what the fierce knight failed to understand was that Li Han hadn't conquered the tower with politics. He had completely bought their absolute loyalty using a single silver coin's worth of barbecue. In this starving academy, meat was the ultimate religion. Snapping back to the deadly present, the tactical meeting concluded. Li Han immediately commandeered a highly polished, glittering hand mirror. Flashing a sharp hand signal to his makeshift army, our genius mage angled the glass directly into the blazing sun. A blinding flash of light pierced the sky. The giant beast's predatory gaze snapped toward the shiny new target. The moment the terrifying creature initiated its deadly dive bomb, Li Han roared his final command. Formation, shield wall, right now. As the students locked their magical barriers together, the real battle began. Lurking in the shadows, our heroes bided their time. Raising his divine staff, Li Han unleashed a blinding surge of light magic straight at the monstrous avian. Blinded by the radiant flash, the beast shrieked in agony and retreated into the sky. Once again, our genius mage left his peers in absolute awe. Meanwhile, Ganondo and the white-haired noble plummeted from the sky, foaming at the mouth. As the giant bird wailed from the treetops, a mysterious figure descended. One look at this suspicious woman, and Li Han froze. She was the spitting image of his tormentor, Professor 𝒂𝒂𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕. With a terrifyingly intense glare, she approached him. She showered the boy with praises, but her fearsome expression sent shivers down his spine. Cut from the exact same cloth, there was no mistaking that terrifying aura. The academy grounds erupted into chaos. A student foolishly asked if she was related to the dreaded Professor 𝒂𝒂𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕. Li Han silently prayed to hide his overpowered skills. He refused to be dragged into another mess. But his clueless classmates had mouths faster than their brains. They proudly declared that Li Han was 𝒂𝒂𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕's favorite disciple. Hearing this, the woman's eyes gleamed with dangerous delight. Li Han felt his soul leave his body. He was absolutely doomed. There was nowhere left to run. She introduced herself as Madame Goddess, the substitute instructor. Professor Venzone had apparently packed his bags and eloped with a unicorn. The entire class gasped in awe. They were completely starstruck by this legendary adventurer. completely forgetting that the apocalyptic thunderbird from earlier was actually her personal pet, a colossal beast far more savage than any normal monster, a living nightmare capable of summoning devastating storms. Yet, this legendary calamity was nothing but a house pet to her. Why unleash such a terror instead of letting them ride it? Madame Goddess pointed her terrifying finger straight at Li Han. Our overpowered protagonist calmly analyzed the situation. He deduced her true motive. She was testing their survival instincts in the face of absolute despair. As another noble tried to argue, Goddess roared with roaring approval. Bingo. Truly a genius mage worthy of her nephew's praise. She declared that while survival was key, mastering the art of riding was their true objective. She marched the class to the stables, forcing Li Han to lead the way. In this fantasy world, horses were the most basic mounts. The arrogant young nobles scoffed. Bored out of their minds, they expected a mundane lesson. But suddenly, Li Han felt the chilling weight of Madame Goddess's affectionate gaze. Goosebumps erupted across his skin. His survival instincts screamed in warning. He whispered to Yoner, bracing for the worst. This was no ordinary academy riding lesson. A true trial awaited them. Arriving at the stables, the beasts inside radiated pure, untamed aura. Madame Goddess pulled out a lottery box to determine their fates. Ganando drew the first turn. Bursting with overconfidence, the foolish noble sprinted ahead. Ignoring the gentle beasts, he stopped before the stall of a fiercely raging black stallion. Before he could even strike a heroic pose, the demonic horse unleashed a brutal headbutt. Jaw shattered, Ganando was knocked out cold before turning 18, an absolute one-hit knockout. Another arrogant noble sneered, mocking the fallen prince. He wisely chose a seemingly harmless white steed. But as he reached out, the beast bared its fangs. Drooling with bloodlust, it clamped its jaws right onto his head. One by one, the elite students were brutally kicked, bitten, and trampled by the demonic horses. Not a single normal mount in sight. These were untamed, menopausal monsters. Madame Goddess threw her head back and laughed like an absolute maniac. Welcome to their first real lesson. Step 1. Befriend these enraged beasts. The pampered academy nobles stared in absolute horror. Shoveling horse dung? Taming apocalyptic stallions? This was pure madness. Befriending these chaotic monsters was a completely impossible quest. They were nothing but a herd of raging lunatics. Li Han frantically searched for the safest option available, but Madame Goddess snatched him away. She dragged our genius mage to a heavily isolated stall. Inside stood a majestic, sparkling white steed of absolute perfection. Li Han was assigned to this flawless beast. The simple-minded nobles seethed with jealousy, thinking he hit the jackpot. But beneath that divine exterior lurked a terrifying truth. It was the most stubborn, wildly untamed beast in the entire academy. Subjugating a monstrous gargoyle would be a walk in the park compared to taming this creature. Li Han prayed for a heroic assist, but reality was relentlessly cruel. If he could fend off a legendary thunderbird, a tyrannical horse should be child's play, right? Meanwhile, Professor Uragom looked like he had seen a ghost. Trembling, he opened his door to welcome the dreaded Madame Goddess. He immediately glared at Li Han in utter betrayal. Why did his favorite disciple bring this walking disaster to his sanctuary? Madame Goddess immediately went on the offensive. Inspecting his home, she unleashed the ultimate nagging spell. When will you get married? She demanded grandchildren immediately. Uragom desperately signaled his overpowered student. Pretend you are starving. Give me an excuse to escape to the kitchen. But Goddess instantly countered. She loudly volunteered to cook an extravagant Eastern feast for them. Left alone in the suffocating silence, Uragom finally noticed the glowing grass crest on Li Han's chest. Li Han proudly summoned his magical staff. The professor's eyes widened in shock. He instantly recognized the supreme quality of this deep forest artifact. But when he asked about its origins, Li Han recounted his epic encounter. Hearing the tale, both of their faces drained of color. That ancient tree was an incredibly volatile and legendary spirit, a being of boundless ancient wisdom, but infamous for its chaotic mood swings. Li Han's eyes sparkled with ambition. Could this staff hold world-shattering invincible soul power? Returning with a mountain of food, Madame Goddess casually shattered his overpowered dreams. Since it came from a tree spirit, its ultimate hidden power was probably just advanced farming support. No world-ending spells today. But in a cruel twist of fate, that supreme agricultural power might actually save his life one day. Hearing about his farming ambitions, Goddess offered her expert help. They prepared to cultivate magical potatoes and yams. Defeated, our genius mage dug into the soil. He violently planted his divine staff into the dirt. But the moment he turned his back, the legendary artifact erupted with blinding light. Meanwhile, at the Blue Dragon Tower, the elite academy students were practically decaying from starvation. Suddenly, a radiant silhouette emerged from the doorway. It was their divine savior, Li Han, carrying a glorious basket of food bestowed by the terrifying 𝒂𝒊𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕. The starving nobles wept tears of joy. In just a few short weeks at this brutal academy, their overpowered classmate had evolved into the ultimate mother bird feeding her helpless chicks. Rolling up his sleeves, Li Han prepared a legendary soup. His movements were breathtaking, flawlessly executing culinary techniques like a transcendent master alchemist. Perfectly seasoned to divine proportions, he distributed the life-saving rations. Beside him, the ruthless Yoner diligently recorded every single debt. Suddenly, a special request arrived. A very important delivery for the royal princess. Ensuring his loyal followers were fed, Arenas took a single trembling bite. His soul ascended as he tasted the very essence of heaven and earth. The princess was absolutely starving. Tossing aside her royal dignity, she devoured the meal right at her doorstep. As reality finally set in, she slammed the door shut in sheer embarrassment, while Li Han just smirked and turned away. The moment our genius mage stepped downstairs, the client group was already sweating bullets in the lobby. Hearing that the princess had finally eaten, a massive wave of relief washed over their pale faces. Desperate, they begged Li Han to become her personal food delivery system, offering double the silver coins as a reward. At the mere mention of cold, hard cash, the almighty mage's eyes gleamed with pure greed, and he accepted the quest on the spot. Back in the basic combat magic class, Li Han was stuck repeatedly drawing beginner mana circles. Professor Vali was known as a lazy instructor, who only did the bare minimum for his paycheck. But right now, his eyes were locked onto Li Han. The boy's magical reserves were absolutely monstrous. Vali refused to let such a generational talent slip through his fingers. For the very first time, the aloof professor actually approached a student, offering to answer any lingering questions. But when Li Han asked about the true purpose of drawing mana circles, Vali just grunted and told him to read the textbook. Li Han tried asking another question, but the professor just stood there in deafening silence. Did this guy seriously not know the answer? Then why offer to help in the first place? After internally wrestling with his own pride, Professor Vali finally stood up to demonstrate his point. He casually held up a simple pen, stating it could easily send Li Han straight to the afterlife. In real combat, a perfect mana circle isn't everything. You only need one lethal weapon to utterly destroy your opponent. Spinning the Starstone is merely training to infuse magic into distant objects. Even a lowly one-circle mage can unleash devastating and terrifying power if they know exactly how to strike 𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒄𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕 power. The battlefield is a chaotic nightmare, filled with immense pressure and terrifying enemies everywhere. However, a mage fortified with an unbreakable foundation can flawlessly slaughter their way out of any hellish scenario. To prove his point, the professor casually flicked his wrist. A blur of pure magic whipped past Li Han, ricocheting violently off the walls at blinding speeds. Yet, the room remained dead silent. There was absolutely no explosive backlash. Professor Vali strolled over and placed a heavy, reassuring hand on Li Han's shoulder. "I know you can reach this realm," Vali declared with absolute certainty. He hadn't broken a single drop of sweat despite casting such high-tier combat magic. This breathtaking display changed everything. Li Han finally understood. Drawing circles held profound, hidden depths within the arcane arts. Underneath that lazy exterior, Professor Vali was actually a true, dedicated master. Seizing the moment, Li Han asked why his basic control magic was so incredibly unstable. Vali immediately diagnosed the problem. The boy's mana pool was simply too vast to control normally. The professor decided to fix this right now. Without a single word of warning, Vali placed his hand squarely on Li Han's chest and activated a terrifying skill. He cast a forbidden, high-level draining spell to violently siphon the boy's magical energy. Absolute panic surged through Li Han's veins as he desperately thrashed against the overwhelming suction. But the professor was in for a brutal awakening. Li Han's mana wasn't just large, it was a catastrophic tsunami. It roared to life, threatening to swallow the professor whole. Vali was blasted back, crashing violently to the floor. By some miracle, he remained conscious, but his face was drained of all color. He had tried to lower Li Han's overwhelming capacity to make it manageable for a student, but the sheer volume had utterly defeated him. Drawing too much power should have instantly knocked him out cold. There was no way a prestigious academy professor would miscalculate his own limits like an amateur. The terrifying truth was simple. Li Han's magical capacity was beyond human comprehension, but Vali refused to give up. If draining failed, he would forcefully awaken the boy's primal instincts. He noted that whenever Li Han lost control of an object, the magical backlash never actually struck his own body. His subconscious instinct was already stepping in to protect him from harm. To master this untamed power, Li Han had to link his sheer willpower directly to the physical objects. Vali didn't waste another second and immediately began the next hellish training phase. He marched to a chest and unleashed a swarm of heavy crystal spheres, targeting Li Han's jaw without an ounce of mercy. He barked at the boy to use his control magic to survive. The spheres shot forward like lethal cannonballs. Li Han frantically deflected them in a life-or-death game of magical dodgeball. After a grueling, desperate struggle against the barrage, he actually managed to block them all. Breathing heavily, our overpowered protagonist realized a grim truth. Not a single professor at this lunatic academy had even a shred of sanity left. But the torment wasn't over. Vali tossed him a solid, heavy iron ball and commanded him to control it. Li Han forced his magic to lift the metal, tracing erratic patterns through the air in every direction. From now on, the fragile starstone was completely useless to him. His mana was simply too dense. He had to use the heavy iron ball to carve his magical circles instead. Starstones were crutches for weak, inexperienced beginners. Li Han had already ascended to an entirely different realm. He no longer needed basic artifacts to channel his overwhelming power, and soon he would rely purely on the iron sphere. Once he mastered this, Vali promised a lethal final exam just like his earlier demonstration. In this brutal world, there are two types of people when facing a deadly crisis: those who freeze and wet themselves in terror, and those who strike back with ruthless brilliance. Vali saw the eyes of a true predator in Li Han. He possessed the ultimate qualifications to become an unstoppable combat mage. The professor drastically changed his teaching methods to push this prodigy to his absolute limits. Later that afternoon, a completely drained Li Han dragged himself to a secret meeting with Daylin. They met because she had smuggled him a sacred priest's robe. To repay her extreme kindness, Li Han had baked a batch of heavenly, mouth-watering pastries with his own 2 hands. But the stubborn priestess firmly refused. Her glorious saint was currently suffering, so as a devout follower, she couldn't dare to indulge in such decadent luxuries. Li Han realized breaking through her holy shell was going to be a massive headache. But wait, what about a simple cup of tea? The moment he suggested it, Li Han rolled up his sleeves, ready to unleash his reincarnated culinary genius. Temple priests only drank bitter, lifeless green tea or black coffee. But our boy was about to introduce her to a modern masterpiece. He secretly dumped a mountain of cinnamon and sugar into the brewing pot. When Daylin caught him red-handed, Li Han pulled out his ultimate acting skills. Looking deeply hurt, he claimed, "This is my family's sacred 3-generation recipe." The poor, gullible priestess was instantly silenced, too polite to complain. His fake tears were absolutely Oscar-worthy. Daylin could only offer an awkward smile and swallow her protests. Smirking inwardly, Li Han poured her a steaming cup of majestic milk tea. She stared at the strange liquid with deep suspicion. But the moment that heavenly nectar touched her lips, bam! Instant addiction. Her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated bliss. The sweet, creamy herbal explosion was something her sheltered taste buds had never experienced. Seeing his trap spring flawlessly, Li Han immediately began brewing Phase 2, a deadly concoction of sugar, nuts, and cocoa. He added boiling water, rich milk, and a touch of cornstarch for maximum thickness. The legendary ganache cocoa tea was officially born. It was so incredibly thick it practically looked like a magical soup. Armed with his most pitiful puppy dog eyes, Li Han gently pushed the cup toward her. Daylin was utterly defenseless. She fell right into his diabolical trap, completely unaware he was planning to fatten her up every single day. As she drained the last drop, Li Han unleashed a villainous smirk. "You better come back for tea every day," he threatened playfully. Soon, the academy's strict curfew tolled through the darkened halls. All students were locked safely inside their towers, but a lone figure crept through the shadows. Wearing the stolen robe and hood, Li Han transformed into a devout, nocturnal priest sneaking out to pray. He slipped onto the first floor completely undetected. It was his first time back in the main hall since the chaotic entrance ceremony. But suddenly, his sharp senses flared. He wasn't alone in the darkness. The figure lurking in the shadows was no professor. It was a masked student from the Black Tortoise Tower, moving with absolute zero sound, a stealth technique mimicking the despised rat beastmen, driven to the darkest corners of the imperial capital, forced into a life of shadows and thievery. But prejudice meant nothing in this magical academy, because right now, this masked rogue held a crucial key. Realizing they shared the exact same target, our genius mage made his move. In a flash, Li Han pressed his magical wand right against the boy's throat. This trembling little thief was Radford, a professional rogue from the White Crow Guild, treated like an invisible ghost by the entire academy. Not bullied, but completely erased from existence. An outcast, desperate for a single shred of recognition, driven by that hunger for acceptance. He had scoured the deadly campus for hidden food supplies, eventually stumbling upon a heavily sealed, highly suspicious door. Radford's rogue talents were no joke. He had actually forged a perfect replica of the magical key. Even Li Han could not help but admire this level of raw genius. Judging by Li Han's flawless aura concealment, Radford assumed he was a predator from the White Tiger Tower. But the moment Li Han revealed his true faction, a proud noble of the Blue Dragon Tower, a direct descendant of the legendary 𝒂𝒂𝒄𝒂𝒓𝒏𝒂𝒕 bloodline, Radford looked ready to drop dead from absolute terror. Our overpowered main character sighed. So used to this dramatic reaction, Li Han casually proposed a temporary alliance. The tiny thief could not believe his own ears. Why would an almighty high-ranking noble team up with a street rat? He asked over and over, his brain short-circuiting. But even with Radford's forged key, the door refused to budge. The ancient magic sealing it was simply too powerful, until Li Han's sharp eyes recognized the arcane crest. He smoothly pulled out an identical key and slid it into the lock. With a satisfying click, the heavy doors groaned open. A masterstroke of preparation. He had directly looted this treasure from the crazy principal's desk, keeping it a total secret from everyone, even his closest allies, storing it alongside a phantom message as his ultimate trump card. Because surviving this hellish academy required absolute paranoia, especially when dealing with that lunatic principal's deadly traps. Beyond the door lay a pitch-black staircase descending into the abyss. Suddenly, Radford's exceptional rogue ears twitched. He pressed against the cold stone, sensing the vibrations. Someone was moving in the depths below, essential supplies being smuggled through secret tunnels, operating strictly during curfew to evade the students' prying eyes. Without a second of hesitation, Li Han stepped down into the darkness. The suffocating pitch-black atmosphere closed in around them. Radford prepared to cast an illumination spell to pierce the gloom, but Li Han instantly snatched his wrist. Casting magic here could trigger another of the Mad Skull Principal's fatal traps. Better to embrace the darkness and move with cold calculation. Li Han led the way with the aura of a veteran dungeon crawler, until they reached a massive underground storage vault. Before they could even cross the threshold, blazing magical flames erupted to life, illuminating the entire subterranean chamber. A lone figure was meticulously taking inventory of the goods. Li Han immediately signaled for absolute silence. But a chilling presence loomed right behind his neck. They had been discovered in the blink of an eye. Li Han's mana surged, ready to cast a blinding light spell and bolt, but he froze in his tracks. The guard's entire face was wrapped in thick bandages. Sightless, but hunting through violently heightened senses. That was how he bypassed their flawless stealth without making a sound. But as the sightless guard peered into Li Han's magical core, he did not see a mere academy student. He saw an infinite, roaring ocean of pure mana, an overwhelming tsunami of magical energy that threatened to crush his soul. Trembling violently, the guard bowed at a strict 90-degree angle, mistaking this monstrous, god-tier power for the crazy skull principal himself. Thanks to his ridiculously overpowered mana capacity, our genius mage casually dodged a brutal execution. Suddenly, the ominous sound of footsteps echoed. Radford immediately took the lead like a phantom, displaying god-tier navigation skills in the labyrinth of darkness, only to abruptly halt as a solid stone wall blocked their path. A dead end? Not against the eyes of our reincarnated genius. A single sweeping glance spotted the hidden trigger. With one precise push, the massive stone wall slid open like a mechanical beast, revealing a brightly lit, expansive tunnel. The absolute path to freedom. He had finally conquered the crazy principal's twisted labyrinth, leaving those idiotic traps in the dust. They emerged into the perilous outer grounds of the academy. The supply couriers here operated under 3 unbreakable laws of survival. Law number 1, see nothing. Law number 2, speak absolutely nothing. And law number 3, bury your deadly curiosity. So, even when they spotted a student and a priest emerging from the forbidden shadows, the hardened couriers acted completely blind. Smooth as silk, Li Han negotiated with a carriage driver for a ride, securing their escape to the outside world. He and Radford sat in the rumbling cart in suffocating silence. This magic academy was the absolute pinnacle of imperial power, meaning it was surrounded by lethal enemies and high-value targets at all times. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a broadsword. This heavy atmosphere was the result of countless bloody encounters. But suddenly, the rushing carriage ground to a violent halt. Li Han peeked through the curtains, and the blood completely drained from his face. What absolute nightmare awaits our overpowered mage now? Smash that like and share button to fuel the magic. The true battle of survival is only just beginning.